Hello everyone, this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 4th episode of Microsoft RF Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft RF Code. Microsoft RF Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning fundamentals of HTML5 and CSS3. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science, and those who are interested in coding, app development, etc. can join us as well. A basic understanding of HTML, CSS and design is essential if you want to go any further on the web. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. As we already told you that these courses are not only beneficial for students but also for working professionals. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Bob Tabor from Microsoft, who is an expert in HTML and CSS with us. He is going to talk about everything you need to know about HTML5 and CSS3. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor or 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous episodes, we covered series introduction, creating HTML5 web page, styling HTML5 web page with CSS3, and understanding the HTML5, working with paragraphs and text, in which we covered coding part, relative part, global attributes, and semantic names for classes. Now we will learn defining the structure of document, working with figures and images, in which we will learn defining an image. After that, we will move towards working with lists and creating tables. So let's get started.
Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about grouping content together. We'll start by talking about lists, which are simply groupings of individual list items. And then we're going to broaden the scope and look at grouping the way that the HTML5 specification understands grouping. And we're going to look at all sorts of groupings. Some we've already looked at, just didn't realize that we're actually looking at a group, and then others that'll be completely new to us. All right, so let's start with talking about lists of things. And there's 3 different types of lists in HTML5. There is the unordered list, the ordered list, and then the definition list. So we always need to start with the specification to see what it says about the semantic meaning of these tags. So again, I encourage you to go to the address. You should already have this bookmarked, but we're looking at the version of the specification called HTML5 Edition for Web Authors. We're going to scroll down and search through the table of contents by hitting Control F on the keyboard. And we're going to start by looking for the UL element, and that'll get us close to not only the UL element, but also the OL element and the LI element. And so let's start with the unordered list, or the UL element. It represents a list of items where the order of the items is not important. That is, where changing the order would not materially change the meaning of the document. And they have some good examples below. Notice this first one: I've lived in the following countries. And then we have a UL and a number of individual list items. Now, one little stylistic thing I want to point out here, notice that they don't use the enclosing /li element. Again, not required in HTML5 for certain items like the list item. I still feel like it's good practice, so I'm going to encourage that when you're writing code, but you don't have to. But changing this list of items does not materially change the meaning of the list. You still have lived in all these countries, regardless of whether you list Switzerland before Norway or Norway before Switzerland. Okay, so that's essentially what they mean by that. Compare that to the OL, the ordered list, where items have been intentionally ordered such that changing the order would change the meaning of the document. All right, and so a good example here would be I've lived in the following countries given in the order of when I first lived there. So now we have imposed on this list a meaning to each of the individual items. We're changing the order of the items would change the meaning of the list, and so you can see that in this case Switzerland comes before UK, before US, before Norway, because we're looking at them in a specific order, the order of when I first lived there. The list item element itself is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot to it. Notice that it can be used in a OL, a UL, or a menu element, which we're not going to talk about in this series, and it just gives some additional examples of individual list items. But I think the best way to get this concept under your belt is a little practice, right? So you should be able to download the code that's associated with this video, either from where you're currently streaming the video or from where you originally downloaded it. It should have a folder inside that zip file called Lesson 08. Inside that folder there is a before, after, and a work folder. In the before folder there's some opportunities for improvement to the HTML file that I have in there. So I'm going to right click and copy that and then go back to the work folder and paste it in, and this is where we're going to do our work. I'm going to open it up in Notepad, use whatever technique you're comfortable with to open it up. And you can see that I have sets of list of items and then some other stuff that we'll get to later on in this lesson. But first of all, we're going to start off by creating an unordered list, because this list of names, you know, although you and I might be used to hearing these names in a specific order, if you're old enough to remember this. However, changing the order doesn't change the fact that each of these people are in the list, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and create an OL. So notice I'm going to start with a beginning and an ending OL for ordered list. And note that I'm just using my space key on my keyboard to create two spaces. This is purely for aesthetic purposes. As I look at the code, it's definitely not necessary. HTML5 will ignore the white space for the most part. Now we're going to look at the pre-tag again here in a little bit, and we'll see how that would affect our use of white space. But I merely do this indentation for my own readability, so I can see kind of the hierarchy or the ownership of the list items and its parent, in this case the ordered list. And I'm just wrapping list items, an opening list item and a closing list item around each of the items. And what I want to do is save the work that we've done with the UL and the OL. And I want to open it up in Internet Explorer and just look at the default, the way that it renders with the default style sheet in Internet Explorer 9.0. The unordered list is rendered by default with just a series of bullets, whereas the ordered list is rendered with a series of numbers. Now, we're going to learn later in this series of videos how we're going to change that, the bullets or the leading character, I guess you'd say, in front of each of these list items using cascading style sheets. And there are a number of options that are available to us there. But this, again, is the default way that it renders in the browser. And so the ordered list has a series of numbers indicating that the order is indeed important. Okay? So let's go ahead and I'm going to shut that tab down and I'm going to close each of these tabs. There's one other list that we want to look at, and it has three parts to it. First of all, it's the DL element, and the DL element contains one or more DT elements and one or more DD elements. All right, and so the DL is a definition list. The DL element represents an association list consisting of 0 or more name value groups, a description list. Each group must consist of one or more names followed by one or more values. Within a single DL element, there should not be more than one DT element for each name. Okay, and so we can see some examples that they've used here. Within a given DL element, there is a series of authors, maybe, for example, in a book that's been written, as well as a series of editors, which in this case there's only one editor. But at any rate, it designates the term authors and the description next to it using a series of DD, or definition description elements. Okay, and so that's really the difference between the two. The DT element represents the term or the name part of a term description group in a description list, and the DD element represents the description, the definition, or the value part of a term description group in a description list. And so anytime you need an association between some notion, some idea, and a series of individual list items that are associated somehow with that notion, you want to potentially create a definition list using a DT for the definition term, and then a series of DDs, definition descriptions, for each of the individual items. All right, and so let's put that into practice here. I have, again, in this lesson 08.html, a couple of terms and their definitions. And so what we're going to do is just wrap a single DL around this entire block. Even though they're really not related, perhaps I have some article I'm working on where I want to create an area where it uses, it defines terms that were used in the article, maybe in a call-out section, and I'm going to go ahead and create the definitions for each of those items. So I'm just wrapping each of these in a series of DTs and DDs. So in this case, autodidact is defined as a self-taught person, whereas utilitarianism, another definition term, it has two definitions. The first one, let's go ahead and then the second one starts here. Alright, so let's see how that's rendered now in our web browser. So I'm going to save the work that I've done and then open it up in lesson 08.html, and notice the indentation levels. For the definition term, there's no indentation, but for the definitions below it, there is a full, I don't know, 50 pixels, maybe 100 pixels, a full tab, I guess you would say, of white space leading into it to make sure you understand the hierarchy between the relationship between the two items. The same is true for the second one, where we have two definition terms, or two definition descriptions underneath the definition term. And you can see they're nicely aligned as well, so you can see the clear hierarchy of the items together. Okay. All right. So we've looked at all three of the lists that we're going to look at in this series, but you know, at a high level, again, we're talking about groupings of items. In this case, we're looking at groupings of list items. But the authors of the HTML5 specification understood the concept of grouping in a more macro sense. And if we can see this, let's close all this down. Here we are in where we were working with the OL, the UL, the LI, the DL, the DT, and the DD. It's all from this grouping content area here in the documentation. And you can see that there are several additional groupings. And when you think about it, for example, it has the paragraph element. Well, the paragraph element is a grouping of thematically similar content together, at least as it was defined in HTML5 specification, as we saw in lesson number 4. In addition to the P element, we have the block quote element, which we learned about in lesson 5, and there's also the figure and fig caption, and the div element, which we learned about in the previous lessons as well. These are all responsible for grouping things just like our lists. What they group is just a little bit different. All right, so what I want to do is pick two additional items from this list and talk about them. We briefly talked about the pre-element. Let's go ahead and open that up in a new tab. And the pre-element represents a block of pre-formatted text in which structure is represented by typographic conventions rather than elements. And so it gives some examples of where this might be used. Email with paragraphs indicated by blank lines, lists indicated by lines prefixed with a bullet, and so on. Fragments of computer code, that's the example that we saw when we were looking at the code element in lesson number 4, with structure indicated according to the conventions of that language, and then finally displaying ASCII art. So back to our examples here, you can see that whenever we open this web page up, at the very bottom here, we have some computer code and then we have some ASCII art, but it loses its value, its meaning, because it's not formatted correctly. And so the pre element will allow it to retain its formatting with the white space and line continuations and things of that nature. So I'm just going to wrap pre's around both of these listings. Pre around the public class hello one, public static void main. This is just a snippet of C# code to create a hello world example. And then here you can clearly see, as I pasted it in, some ASCII art of an alien. All right. And now whenever we've added the pre tags to it and we open it up, this will look like actual code, and this will look like ASCII art. Okay? And so that's all that we use the pre tag for. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the HR element. Let's close all this down. And you can see that's another one of these items in the grouping content list here. And the HR element represents a paragraph level thematic break. For example, a scene change in a story or a transition to another topic within a section of a reference book. All right, so it derives its name from a horizontal rule, HR, which indicates presentation, but it has been repurposed. Previously, you would use it to just create a line across the screen, okay, and you think about it purely in terms of presentation, but it's been repurposed as a grouping function in HTML5 to group, or rather, to do the opposite, to separate themes in a given document. Still, its default style sheet, as you're going to see in a moment, is a horizontal rule or horizontal line on a web page, but now it has this rich semantic meaning. So I think probably the easiest way to do this is just to add an HR element, and we can just type it like that, or we can use a self-enclosing with a slash near the end of the angle bracket. I'm just going to use the format that I probably will use now that we're working with HTML5, which is just the HR element by itself. And we can see how it's rendered as we separate one thematic idea from a new thematic idea using this horizontal rule, this HR. All right, and it just by default, with the default style sheet in Internet Explorer, creates a horizontal line. However, again, as we looked in the specification, it doesn't have to be rendered that way necessarily, and we're thinking more semantically. It's separating two different ideas but are added to the same document. Okay? All right, so we've covered all the grouping content here or in previous lessons. So now let's move on to tables and learn their proper uses as well as their abuses in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about tables. So whenever you need to render tabular data, you want to use the HTML5 table, which is comprised of about a dozen optional HTML5 elements. At a minimum, you probably want to define a header row, so a row that explains what each of the columns are for, as well as individual data rows that contain cells with the data you want to display to the end user. I'll be referencing the elements described in this document in the specification, the edition for web authors. We're going to scroll down, take a look at, and hit Control F to find Tabular Data. So this section, which is 4.9 in my version of the document, we're going to look at many of these elements, including the T-body, the T-head, the TR, the TD, and the TH, and so on. Okay. It's also important to note that, again, many of the table's elements are completely optional. So you use the parts that are semantically necessary to convey the idea that you're trying to convey in your table of data. You're trying to avoid parts adding parts purely for presentational or styling purposes. That's the job of cascading style sheets again, okay? So to really exercise this idea, instead of going through an academic discussion of each of these items, let's go ahead and have some fun. You'll want to download the code that's associated with this video wherever you're currently streaming the video from, or wherever you originally downloaded this video to play. There should be a code file. If you open up that .zip file, there should be a folder called Lesson 09. Inside of that folder, there is a before, after, and a work folder. So we want to take the before, and we're going to copy it, the lesson09.html file in the before folder, and copy it into the work folder. And so here's where we're going to do our work. We're going to open this up in Notepad. So I'm going to right-click, open with Notepad. Use whatever technique that is comfortable for you. All right, and so what I want to do at this point is I'm going to create a table of information that displays the recent statistics for my favorite hockey player, Jonathan Toews of the Chicago Blackhawks, and I'm going to display his stats over the last couple of seasons, and I'm going to use a table to display that. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with an H2 element just to kind of explain what this is for and give it a name here. So Jonathan Toews stats, and then I'm going to start with the table element, and then I'll just go ahead and create the closing table element for the very bottom. And then what I want to do is create a header row, and to create the header row I'm going to use the T head and then a closing T head. And again, notice that I am indenting just to show levels for readability's sake, not because they have any real importance within HTML itself. But you know, the T head element represents a row of data that's considered to be the heading row. There's also a T foot, which is similar, but obviously for a footing row for whenever you want to calculate totals or whatever the case might be. But here what we want to do is have a series of TH elements, and each of these represent a cell, a header cell of data considered to have the heading information, but doesn't contain any data, no numbers or statistics, for example. Okay, so here we're going to have 3 cells or 3 columns across the top, one for the season, and again I can leave off the closing TH, but in my style I like to include it. Goals and assists. All right, now below the T head we're going to create a T body, and this is where we'll include all of the individual rows of information, the statistics themselves. Okay, and so in the T body we're going to create a series of rows, and you create a row by using the TR or table row element. So opening, closing TR, and then because we want the first column to indicate the season, I'm going to go ahead and use a TH for that as well, which again is a table header, because it does provide some heading information even though it's in the leftmost column. You see this often in when you're working with tables. And then we'll have table data, TDs, for the individual statistics themselves. All right, so for example, this season will be the 2009-2010 season. He had 25 goals and then 43 assists. All right, so at this point we have enough information to see how it's rendered in a web browser. So let's go ahead and open it up, and you can see it's not beautiful, but that's not important right now. We want to convey intent, and so we have our header row, our header cell that includes the season, and then the individual statistics 25 and 43 for goals and assists. Okay, so let's just continue on and flesh this out completely. And I'm going to take the same tact here. In fact, now that I have this structure in place, and I know I'm going to need several of these, I'm just going to copy and paste this a couple of times. That should be sufficient. And we're going to create the 2010 to 2011 season, and then we'll create the 2011 to 2012 season. I think I forgot something here. There we go. And I guess I don't need this last one. All right, so here we have the 32 and 44, and then here we have 29 and 28. All right, so let's go ahead and see what that looks like. All right, more of the same. Great. Now, for example, what if I needed to create a row that describes something that he was involved in, like the Olympics, for example, and I wanted to span the entire row? I can use one cell, and then I'm going to stretch it out using an attribute of the table data called callSpan. And I'm going to set that equal to 3. So whatever data I put in here, so I want to just make a note, 2009 to 2010, also played for Canada at Olympics. All right, now this might change my formatting of my table a little bit, pushing things out a little bit, but you can see I'm able to create one cell that spans the entire width of the table by using this callSpan. In this case, I want it to stretch 3 columns. All right, so where did I get columns from? When you create these cells, you're creating essentially columns. All right, so at the very bottom of this, let's add some things up here. And to do that, we're going to add a T foot. And so we'll create a TR and a closing TR. And then we'll use a header to explain that this row is for the totals. Okay? Again, much of what I'm doing here is optional. It's just a matter of using the correct markup for what I'm intending to do here. And so again, the data will be 86 and 115, I happen to know. And so what would you expect to see here? Well, an additional row, and it looks nothing different even though it's a footer as opposed to the body, but that's what, again, CSS is for, to style this up and to make it look great. Okay, and I think that's all that I'm going to do for now. There are other tags that we could use, optional tags for creating call groups and individual columns, and that would allow us to style. If you had, like, 10 columns represented by your cells here, how many cells you've created, you could create a series of call groups and style them differently so that you can see like a light gray or a white background alternatively for each of the cells or each of the call groups. All right. So one last thing before we conclude this. In this series of lessons, I try to ignore much of the history of HTML. However, in the case of the lowly, much aligned HTML table, it's hard to ignore. You may hear people say developers should never use tables for layout, and I completely agree with that. However, that does not mean that you should never use tables at all. When web browsers first arrived back in 1992, 93, I guess, somewhere around there, they had limited capabilities for positioning major sections of a website on the screen. Somebody realized that you could use tables for this purpose to create basically a series of grid cells for your entire web page, and then it would make it easy to align things on the web page by turning it into a series of grid cells with rows and columns. However, there are several problems with this approach. From an HTML5 perspective, the most obvious problem is that semantically a table has a precise meaning, a representation of table data like we did here, we created here in this lesson. Using it for layout, abuses the purpose of the table. Furthermore, it creates fixed width pages. Now, most of the internet, quite frankly, uses fixed width pages, but that's changing. As we're going to see later in this series, the new goal for web page layout and design should be a responsive design, or a fluid or liquid design that allows the web page to adapt correctly depending on whether you're working on a small device or a large screen. The layout of the page will change based on the current dimensions of the web browser, where the given the space available for the given device that the user is looking at your web page with. Again, this is a topic for much later in this series, but positioning our content in tables would take us back to a thought process prevalent in 1995, not 2012, 2013 and beyond. All right, so if you ever get tempted to use tables for and putting paragraphs inside of them in order to get everything positioned, absolutely stop yourself. Don't do it. Don't go down that road. At the very minimum, you'll be ostracized by small children in the streets, but worst case scenario is that you're not really setting yourself up for the future of web development. Okay, so I think that's all I need to say about that. Tables serve a purpose. Use them for that purpose. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about HTML5 Forms. Up to now, all of our HTML5 work has been to display information to the user. In this lesson, we begin to retrieve information from the user. And I know you've used forms on web pages before. If you've ever signed up for a username and password for a website, if you've ever registered for a webinar or some other event, if you've ever purchased anything on the internet, then you've used a form. And there are different types of form fields that you can use to collect different types of data, or rather to restrict the types of selections or choices that a user can make. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about forms and even build a simple form with several elements on it. In the next lesson, then we're going to add some additional elements and talk about validation on the client, which is new to HTML5. So let's start with the basics of forms. Whenever a user types information into form fields, like a text box for example, or makes selections in form fields, like a checkbox or a radio button for example, they have to somehow trigger the submission of all the form information that they have filled out back to the server. All the information in the form, so all the data that they type or the selections that they make, it all gets bundled up and sent to the web server. How the data is bundled up and the destination of the data is determined by the settings in the HTML element called the form element. And so here's a typical form element. We'll be writing one of these on our own here in just a little bit. But we have a form element and a closing form element, and then there are two important attributes, the method and the action. And you can see that I've set the method equal to post. Post is one of several different types of HTTP messages. A post message says that you should encode up all of the form data and bundle it into the body. Think about putting it inside of an envelope, I guess you could say, of the HTTP message. If that data is sensitive, then it will typically encode all of the stuff in the envelope, all the data in the message body, using a secure sockets layer certificate. And so when you take a look at the action attribute in our form, you'll see that there's an HTTPS. The S on the end typically indicates that you're working with the secure sockets layer certificate. Okay? So the HTTP message of post is in contrast to the HTTP get message, and that bundles up all the data and puts it in the query string as a set of name value pairs. So that's roughly the equivalent of taking all the form data and sticking it on the front of the envelope, okay, where anybody can see it as you mail it off into put it into the mail system. Honestly, most of the time you're not going to want to do this because it limits the amount of data that you can send. There's only so much space on that envelope's, front side, and it prevents the data from the benefit of being encrypted by a secure sockets layer certificate. Anybody can read whatever's on the front of that envelope. If you were to encrypt that, the postmaster would look at it and say, I have no idea what you want me to do with this. It's just garbled, right? But if you were to encrypt the information inside the envelope, that would be just fine. It could still make it to its destination. So think about it roughly in those terms. If you want to learn more about the differences between HTTP GET and HTTP POST, check out this Wikipedia article as a good starting point. All right, so we talked about the method equals post, but now let's talk about the action. That attribute is the destination of the form's submission. Typically, the form submission will be to a server-side technology like ASP.NET or PHP or CGI using Perl or a number of other server-side related technologies. Now, that's out of scope for this series of lessons, but ASP.NET would be a great next step for you if you want to learn how to do serious web development, where you're interacting with databases, even taking that form field information that people submit, saving it into a database, or retrieving it out and creating new web pages, creating a template and filling in the areas of the page with data from a database to make it dynamic. But at any rate, that's for another day, another time. In this lesson, I can show you all the types of data that we can collect on a form on the client side using HTML5. And those form fields are defined between an opening and closing form tag. So for this video, I'm going to use a modified version of the example that we find here in the HTML5 specification. Notice I'm on this version of the specification called the Edition for Web Authors. Just as a reminder, we're looking through the table of contents for the entire specification. I'm going to open up my Find toolbar by using Control F on the keyboard and then typing in Forms, and you can see that that brings me to section 410, and there's quite a bit of information under 410. That's because forms are a really large topic. We're only going to look at a small subset of that. But if we were to open this up in a new tab, it uses a pizza shop, an online pizza delivery form as an example, and so I want to create a modified version of this for our purposes, but feel free to look through this and to complete the example using their code instead of my code after you've finished this video, just to learn a little bit more. Alright, and so my example is going to be an absolute minimalist approach. Frankly, there will be a lot missing in my example with regards to attributes of the elements on the page, and so I'm going to just work through and point out the various elements along the way, but there will be much more to learn after this lesson is over. Okay, and to that end, make sure that you download the code file that's associated with this video. You can download it from wherever you originally downloaded this video to watch it locally on your computer, or from wherever you're streaming the video currently. There should be a zip file with code in it. There is a folder called Lesson 10 inside of that zip folder, and there will be 3 subfolders: before, after, and work. What I want to do is go to the before folder. I'm going to copy the lesson10.html page. I'm going to paste it into the work folder where we're going to do all of our work. And then, like we've done in every other video, I'm going to right click and select Open with Notepad. Use any technique you're comfortable with, but this will be a good starting point for creating our own forms. So we're going to start off by creating an opening and closing form tag. As we said at the outset, we need some attributes here. In the first attribute, we'll create a post and then an action, and we're just going to set it to a fictitious page that doesn't really exist. This will not work. If we were to create a full ASP.NET example, then this might be the basis for that, but if we were to hit the submit button, once we get to that point on the form, nothing will happen because form.aspx does not exist today. Okay? Alright, so let's continue on then, and we want to collect the user's name. So we're going to use a text box that will allow them to type in their name into our form. So I'm going to open and close the paragraph, and then I'm going to open up a label, and inside that label I'm going to say customer name, and then I'm going to open up an input element. And there are different types of input elements, so I'm going to select the type that I want to use. I'm going to use a text box, so type equals text, and then I want to give it an ID and a name, and I'll discuss that a little bit later, why I'm doing this for all these elements. But I'm going to name it the same, customer name and customer name. Just be sure to follow along. We'll explain why we're doing this much later in this lesson. Alright? And if at this point we were to save what we've done and open it up in Internet Explorer by just double clicking the web page from our work folder, you can see we get a text box. And so I can start typing in the name and just keep typing and typing and typing and typing. So clearly this isn't a good situation. What we want to do is limit the number of characters that somebody can type into our text box. And to do that, I'm going to set another attribute called max length, and I'm going to set that to 10. Might be a little short for a name, but it'll again allow us to at least exercise the max length attribute. So now as I begin to type, notice that it stops at about 10 characters, which is perfect. Alright, so let's continue on. The next thing that I want to do is retrieve information like the size of the pizza that the individual is ordering and then the pizza toppings. And so with regard to size, there's only 3 options: small, medium, and large. And so you can't choose small and large at the same time. We want to restrict the selections that the user can make. And to do that, we're going to use a series of radio buttons. Radio buttons are usually just circular buttons as they're represented in HTML, and you can select one, and when you choose one, the other 2 will become unselected. If you choose one of those, then your original selection will go away, so you can only make one selection from that list. And to kind of represent all of the given options together, we're going to kind of enclose them in a field set. And let me go ahead and type it out, then I'll explain what a field set is. So let's start with field set and then a closing field set. And inside of the field set, I'm going to create a legend. I'll talk about what that is here in a moment. And we're going to just call this legend pizza size. All right. And so a field set groups form elements together with a common name, and the legend provides the name, in this case, pizza size. All right. And the legend has to be the first child of the field set. Just a little technical note there. So you'll see that once we add our individual radio buttons here in between the field set, open and close field set elements, you'll see that it creates a little box around it with a name in the upper left hand corner by default using Internet Explorer's default style sheet. Of course, we can change that. But let's create a series of paragraphs, a series of labels, and inside of those labels we're going to put an input type equals, and instead of a text field we're going to use a radio for radio button. And now I'm going to give each radio the same name, size, because each of them are going to be submitting either a small size, a medium size, or a large size. And so to differentiate each of those sizes, we're going to give it a value, for example, small. And then outside of the boundaries of the input element, I want to type whatever the user will see. So for like a example, a 10-inch pizza. All right, so this is the friendly text that the user sees. This is the value that will be submitted back to the web server if the user selects the small sized pizza. All right, and of course we want to finish out our label as well. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to highlight that entire line and copy and paste it 3 times because we want each of them to have the same name value. We will change each of the values, like medium, for example, and large, and then the text that the user sees. For example, medium, 12-inch, and then the large will be a 6 or a 14-inch. Okay. So now, if we were to save this and then view it inside of our web browser, it would look like this. And so you can see the field set is what gives this a boundary. It puts a box around it, and you can see the legend up here kind of sits on top of that boundary. And here I have a series of radio buttons, and by selecting one, it deselects all the other options. Okay, which is perfect for small, medium, and large. Next thing I want to do is create a field set that will allow us to capture which toppings the user wants on their pizza. So let's start with a field set and a closing field set. And then we're going to add a legend, a closing legend. And here we're going to type in pizza toppings. Great. And beneath that, all right, I'm going to start with a paragraph. And inside that, I'm going to add a label. So I'll go ahead and close out the label because I forgot to do that last time. And then inside the label, I'm going to add an input The type of input I want to use is a checkbox. All right, and then I'm going to give it a name, and we're just going to call this toppings. All right, and then I'm going to set the value for this individual checkbox. I'm going to go ahead and leave it empty for now because I want to use this sort of as a template for the other items. I'm going to have 4 items total available for the pizzas. And so we're going to add bacon. So the first time I type in the value of bacon is what gets submitted to the server. This is the text that the user will see in their web browser. All right. So cheese, and we might say, like, for example, extra cheese. Onion, and then finally mushroom. I guess we're going mostly vegetarian here. I guess bacon wouldn't fall in that category. Okay, but now let's go ahead and save this, and let's see what we come up with. There we go. So we have another field set, box around it with our legend pizza toppings, and we can select as many of these as we want to. All right? Let's go ahead and minimize that. And now let's ask what type of field set, or I'm sorry, what type of crust the user wants. So we're going to go back to a paragraph, and here I'm going to add a select. Let me close out the paragraph. So here's a begin and end select, and inside of that we want to create a series of options. And so we're going to say normal. And I'm going to copy and paste this a couple times. Here we got Chicago deep dish. And we'll say that's plus $2. And then we're going to go New York thin. All right. And I want to also designate a value for each of these options, and the value is what will be sent back to the web server for this given select control, and we need to give this a name of crust. So the name will be crust, and then the user can choose at this point just one option, either, and we'll use a little coding here, a C1, a C2, or C3. So hey Vinny, we got a C3. Go ahead and, work up more New York thin crusts for us, okay? Something along those lines. So here we go. Let's go ahead and save this and open it up in a browser, and you can see what it looks like. All right, so here is a drop-down list box where we can choose normal, deep dish, or New York thin. Great. And it doesn't take up any vertical spacing. Now what we could do is add an attribute called multiple, and just by adding that single attribute, notice what happens. It changes from a drop-down list to show all the options that are available. Now you can restrict that size and make it only show like 3 or 5 options. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Okay, so at any rate, what if I wanted to pre-select the normal option? Well, what we could do, or pre-select the Chicago deep dish, because that's our specialty. We'll just add the selected attribute and refresh, and you can see by default Chicago deep dish is selected. I believe this will work on any of these. Let's try selected and radio type medium selected, and let's see what we get. Actually, I think it's checked. There we go. Checked is the right option. Similar in thought, just a different attribute. Okay. So by default, a medium, and all pizzas will include onion by default unless you deselect it or if you change the size. Okay. Alrighty. Let's continue on here, and I'm going to add an area for the user who's ordering a pizza to type in any delivery instructions, and I'm going to use a different type of input box called a text area, so it has a whole different element name, and we're going to give it a name equal comments, and here we're going to give it a number of columns and a number of rows. So we'll give it 50 columns in width and then 5 rows in height. And then also we're going to add the max length and only allow 1,000 characters. So let's go ahead and save that and look at it. And you can see I've done something wrong here. The problem is I didn't add a closing text area. And what it did was it treated everything after the opening text area as text that belongs inside. So we might say inside here, how do we get to your house? Alright, and you can see how that will manifest itself here. And notice that it uses kind of a pre, so we may want to even remove some of this if we wanted to default that. Alright, there we go. And we could delete this and say, go to the end of the street, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And I think that's an important point too, because we can pre-fill these, like the text area, for example, the text input by adding a value to begin with. What is your name? Now, admittedly, this wouldn't be too smart because it would force the user to have to go in and delete all that and then type. And there are some ways for us to kind of, you'll see this effect on some forms that they put like a little description of what the form is inside of the box in a very light gray font, and then you put your mouse cursor in and it disappears. They're using a combination of JavaScript and a plugin called jQuery. If you want to know more about at least the basics of what the foundation you'll need to introduce that into your web forms, you'll want to watch the JavaScript and jQuery foundational series also on Channel 9. Okay. So at any rate, I just wanted you to know about the value. Let's go ahead and remove that for now, and how we were able to introduce information into our text area, and I'm removing that as well. Now up to this point, we haven't given the user any way to actually say, okay, I've filled out all the information on my form, let's go ahead and send that information to the web server and continue on with the ordering process. So we need a submit button, and we'll talk about the different kinds of input types for submitting forms. The easiest way to do this is input type equals submit, value equals continue to step 2. But we can also do something called a reset. So you'll see this sometimes in older web pages. Reset value equals reset values. And let's see how these are manifested. Alright, so now at the very bottom you can see we have a continue to step 2. If we were to click that, it will try to open up form.aspx. Obviously we don't have that, so we get this Internet Explorer cannot display the web page, and that's perfectly fine. We'd have to pick that up in an ASP.NET series, alright? But if we were to make selections here like customer name, the options that we want, New York thin crust, and type in some delivery instructions, and then hit reset values, notice we use that input type equals reset, and it resets all the options back to their original. Okay, so those are the two different types of buttons that we can use, and there are a couple more. We'll talk about that in just a moment. One last thing that I want to talk about is the label. Up to this point, we've been wrapping the label around the entire control and any text inside of it. However, there's another way to use the label control. Let me just demonstrate here, or the label element rather. We can add a for attribute, and so we can say it's for the comments, and it should look exactly the same. It's just a different way of doing it, and you'll see that used sometimes. All right, so delivery instructions, and there you go. Okay, so one thing I wanted to point out, and I wasn't really consistent with this, but I started doing this at the very top. You'll notice that in this case I use the attribute name and the attribute ID. Typically the ID is used on the client side for scripting, like whenever you're creating JavaScript to create some validation on the client to make sure that somebody filled in the information here, it wasn't too long, that perhaps it really does look like a phone number, some initial validation on the client side using JavaScript. You'll typically want to reference items using an ID, whereas on the server it expects to see a name. That's part of what gets packaged up in the HTTP post and stuffed into the HTTP request envelope, I guess you would say, and sent over to the web server. And so you have to use the name for that purpose. And so I would recommend using both on your elements and then keeping the names identical just for clarity in your own mind whenever you're doing web development. Okay, let's continue on here. We've seen several examples of input elements. We've looked at input type equals text, input type equals radio, input type equals checkbox, input type equal or select rather, and then also the text area. Input type equals submit, input type equals reset. But there are quite a few other input elements that can be used. You can see these on screen right now. Here's a complete list. The ones that we haven't looked at are input type equals password, hidden, file if you want to upload or allow a user to upload a file. There's some work that has to be done on the server as well to accept the file, but creating the ability for somebody to click a button and choose from a file picker off of their local computer which file they want to upload, that gives it that capability. There's also, we looked at the submit and reset. There's an image for an image button, so you can use a image instead of the Battleship Gray style buttons like we've used here in our example. And then there's also just a type equals button. And then there are different types of buttons. There's the button type equals button, button type equals submit, and the button type equals reset. So you might be wondering what the difference is between input type equals submit and button type equals submit. And so basically the button has more CSS properties available to it for the purpose of styling. One of the biggest features is the ability to include images on the button itself using the button control or the button element. So the creator of a tool called Wufoo, a popular forms product on the web, he wrote up a really interesting blog post about his experiences at this URL that you see on screen. It's one of the best articles for an in-depth look, and I recommend that you look into that if you're interested in that information. Okay, so to wrap up this lesson, I just want to say that this is really only half of the story when it comes to forms in HTML5. We've covered the basics that are supported by older versions of HTML, and in the next lesson I want to specifically target the new features that are added in HTML5. I promised that I would try to avoid this. However, the fact of the matter is that at the time that I recorded these lessons, Internet Explorer 9 doesn't support many of the HTML5 features related to forms. However, Internet Explorer 10.0 does support many of them, and so we'll want to see that in action in the next lesson. But don't worry, I'll explain the ramifications of using these new HTML5 form elements in the next lesson. Be sure you watch it. We'll see you there. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. You can download the entire series code from the links given below. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code. brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.